Hello everyone, my name is Bruce Johnson and I teach business classes at South Dakota State University and have taught finance classes in my past at the University of Sioux Falls in their MBA program. So I've received a number of requests lately asking if I would ever consider putting some YouTube videos out, especially ones on the popular lectures that I give and some of the popular tools and tips and techniques that I openly share with many others, to include clients, students, friends, family, anybody that is, I would say, a go-getter or competitive, that type of person. So I try to add a lot of that in the content that I teach normally in class. And again, I've asked if I would ever consider putting some of that information out there for others. Now, I have to say all of the topics, tips, tools, techniques, so on and so forth that I teach, virtually none of it is something I invented or created. In fact, I would say most ideas are created through synthesis. It's pretty rare for anybody to come up with a completely innovative, totally new idea, new way of doing something. So I haven't done that. What I've done in the exercise I'm going to share with you today is I've put together two tools that I haven't seen anybody else out there suggest using. These are free of charge, and I'll do my best to try to put up a link for a Word document that I share with my students to help them get ready for job interviews. Now, again, this is for those folks that are usually trying to get a job in a highly competitive environment. Recently, one young lady that I had worked with and helped coach, she was going up against about 50 other applicants. On top of it, the job was asking that the candidates have 3 to 5 years of experience, which she didn't have, but it was her dream job and she wanted to see if there was a chance. She did phenomenal. She made it down to 2 people out of the 50. They narrowed it down, and she didn't get it mostly because the other person had 10 years of experience. So that being said, she was very grateful. She said the exercise that we use to help young people out when they're getting ready for interviews it worked well, or so she thought. So, and most of my students really got a charge out of it. So as I thought about what am I going to put out here on YouTube, I'm trying to figure out, of the popular lectures that I give in my classes and the topics that I talk about and some of the tools and techniques, I'm trying to ask what's the common denominator in all of those, and maybe that I could use that as a name for a YouTube site to put videos under, and I'm struggling. So the closest thing I can figure out is the popular tips, tools, techniques that I teach in class, I would say are associated with sort of a competitive capitalistic environment, and relates to those people that ultimately I think would like to wield power, people at the top of a hierarchy. So if you want to climb the corporate ladder, some of these tools and techniques might be of benefit to you. That's actually something I did in some thesis work way back in the day, is studying what skills are needed by people that are at the top of the echelon. What skills do they need to effectively do their job? So a lot of what I talk about, even though the class maybe isn't particularly associated with that, I try to add those in, and those are the topics that the students enjoy most. So I'm going to share a number of those with you on this site. So the tool that I'm going to show you here, I created about 10 years ago, and it relates to selling yourself in a job interview. So I think too often when people hear that you need to sell yourself, they think it is somehow associated with humble bragging. And humble bragging is, you're trying to sound like you've accomplished a lot, but you're not necessarily overly proud about it, or it's just something you did. Anybody that gets near humble bragging, it sounds weird. Okay, and I would not suggest using it, and that really isn't what selling yourself is. So the exercise that I shared with students is one that works way better to sell yourself, and far more importantly, it helps give that employer the information they really want and really need to figure out if you would be a good fit for that job. So before I get to this exercise, I kind of wanted to share where I got the idea with it. So I used to work in banking back in the day, and when it comes to interviewing, I am reminded of two interviews that I had sat in with a team of 4 managers, and I don't know, it was probably 20 applicants that were applying. And the branch that I ran was really, we were struggling for employees, and we were trying to get some new people in. I'd have a number of people that part-time students that had graduated from college, and they were moving on and moving forward in other positions in the company. So I was kind of in dire need of some candidates. So we sat through these 20 interviews, and I remember 2 of these interviews being by far and away the best interviews I have ever sat in. The applicants, one was male, one was female. They were dressed the right way, especially if you're trying to get a job at a bank. They presented themselves in a cool, calm, professional, collective manner. Every question they answered, it was perfect, absolutely perfect. They were telling us everything we wanted to hear. Now, I was fortunate, so after these interviews, because my need was a little greater than some of the other branches, I was lucky enough to get both of these candidates come to work at my branch, or so I thought. So these 2 folks worked at my branch for about 3 or 4 months, and thank God they both decided to quit and resign. Subsequently, these were probably 2 of the worst employees I had ever had the opportunity to work with. I remember my staff just scratching their heads at looking at me saying, how could have you hired these 2 people? As an example, each one of the candidates, it said in one part in the interview that they, would you rather work independently or with a team? And both of them said with a team. Now, after the fact, come to find out, not only was that not the case, but both of them were fairly introverted. And the job that they were being asked to do, I'd say, didn't fit very well for someone that's overly introverted. Both of them were terrible when they worked with customers, etc. So I started kind of asking myself, okay, how do you have 2 of and every manager that was in those interviews said those 2 candidates were great. Just awesome. Had resumes. Their resumes told us exactly what we needed to know and what we wanted to hear. So I for a long time, I've asked myself, what happened? And when I'm dealing with the rest of my employees, they're looking at me like, am I insane or nuts? And I tried to explain to them, no, the interviews were wonderful, and they were the best candidates out of the 20 that we interviewed. So again, routinely asking myself, well, how can you sell yourself, and what is it the employer needs to know? And as I thought about it, I realized why these 2 young people they were in their early 20s, how both of them could have answered those questions so spot on. And I realized the answer was because they Googled it. They went online, they researched how to answer the strength or weakness questions and all the other questions that are almost always asked in an interview. Now, some students have asked me, well, what if they don't ask those common interview questions? That might happen, but 9 out of 10 times it's not going to happen. Good managers and good HR people know there's illegal interview questions that can be asked. And you do not want to ask an illegal interview question, especially if that candidate knows it's an illegal question. You don't want them filing a complaint with the EEOC. So again, most good HR managers and most good managers, they'll either have a script with questions already pre-printed, or right before they go in an interview, they'll Google legal interview questions, and it's almost always 10 of the same interview questions. Again, to respond to the students that ask, well, what if they're asking something else? I've never heard or seen where an interviewer asked a question that wasn't pretty much job related to whatever you were being applied for. And again, I think the reason for that is that can stray off into kind of that illegal interview questions, and it's pretty rare for that to happen. So that being said, then there's about 10 or 15 interview questions that are almost always asked. And what these two young people had done is they had Googled that, and then they had learned what it was recommended on how you answer these questions. So they had prepared. And when I asked them, I said, "Oh, you guys great in your interview." And one of them told me that they had been in a seminar that taught them how to answer those questions, and their roommate and them sat there and practiced it, and that's why the interview was so good. But we still have a bit of a problem. Now, along that same time I was thinking about this and those interviews and how to sell yourself, I was reading some articles in the Wall Street Journal, and the articles were talking about using personality testing or psychometrics in the interview process and debating whether or not it was legal, and it's fine to do that. And now we do have a little bit of regulation associated with that. You usually have to prove that psychometric test or personality assessment is valid for whatever it is you're hiring for. So, but it was discussing that, and I had kind of an epiphany. I realized that if these two candidates, instead of telling me exactly what I wanted to hear, if they would have communicated to me the truth and how they really were, that they were introverted and they preferred working not in a team but alone, and instead of answering those questions what I wanted to hear, if they just would have told them what they're, how they are, we could have determined if they would have been a good fit for this job. Now, in this situation, when you're selling yourself, and this works, I teach personal selling, so this is a common theme when I'm teaching. What you're always trying to do is you're trying to produce the best result for your client or your customer. You're trying to produce the best result for yourself. You're trying to produce the best result for your employer. And if you want to throw another one in there, you're trying to produce the best result for the world overall. Okay, so you're trying to hit all those things. And if you can answer or figure out how to get to that, that's kind of the right way to do it, or the right answer. So when I look at these two candidates that were applying for this position, I might ask them questions, and if they would have told me, not what I wanted to hear, but closer to the truth there, I probably would have figured out that, this probably isn't a good fit for you then. This isn't the right job. Now, really think about that. They were trying to answer the question to get the job. But if you were to rewind and tell them, look, you're going to get the job, but now you're going to have a 4-month gap in your resume. You're not going to have a good reference. There's no way I would ever be a reference for either one of those individuals. And now you got a bit of a problem, because they were both college graduates and they were actually both working full-time for me. So they wouldn't have wanted to have answered those questions like they did if they knew what was best for them and what was best for the company that they were going to work for, what was best for the clientele that the company served, and really for the world overall. They weren't doing what was the best option in all 4 of those situations. So that brings us to, well, how should a person answer that? And once we realize maybe the right way to answer that, I think you learn how you actually sell yourself. Selling is not ever trying to persuade somebody to do something that they may or may not want to do. That's not what modern sales is. Modern sales is about helping to provide a solution to a problem along those lines, and to do so in a professional manner. It's almost as if you're a consultant just trying to help somebody make a decision. So that's modern sales. That old sleazy used car salesman picture that people have in their mind, that mode of selling, that traditional mode of selling, has not worked since the 1970s, and it didn't really work back then either. Research has shown, what does work, and when you look at that, you realize, it's the type of person that wants to help others out. So here's what I figured out. So thinking about both of these, I came up with an exercise for my students. Let me go ahead and get there, and I'll show this to you. I call it the interview exercise. Try to blow this up a little bit. In the exercise, what I have my students do, or again, the folks that I'm consulting with or trying to help, clientele, friends, family, etc. The first thing I ask them to do is find the job description for whatever job you're trying to apply for, or one that you want to apply for in the future that really fits along, the path that you're choosing to pursue. So I have them go out and find a job description. Now, I've helped coach a few managers and executives. When they've asked about that, we simply say, if they're trying to get a promotion, find the job description for the promotion that you're wanting to get. So you need to have that to do the exercise. The second thing I have them do is take the Myers-Briggs typology indicator, and that's it gives one of the 16 various personalities according to Myers and Briggs, which was derived from Carl Jung's work with archetypes. So the two sites that I recommend are actually free of charge to at least take the test, and those are Truity.com, and what you're looking for is Type Finder Personality Test, or humanmetrics.com, which is humanmetrics.com/personality test/test. I have them take the test, and then once they get a score, I have them write down the 4-letter score, and that's usually how you would search that type of personality. But I also have them write down the numeric score that's right next to each one of those letters, if that's available. And the reason I have them do that is because if they read over their personality type and their profile, and they say to themselves, this doesn't really sound like the right fit, then what we'll do is look at their score. We'll try to look at the numeric score next to it, and if the numeric score is quite low, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that, then we'll have them look at the opposite of whatever they got. So for example, I have ISTJ here. Maybe on the S and N dimension, they had an S of like 2. Well, then instead of looking at ISTJ, they might want to look at ENTJ. Okay, so we're just trying to, you want to be able to answer if this profile sounds like a pretty good fit for you. Now, another option is sometimes I'll have students that will take this, say this doesn't sound like me, and I'll say, we'll check the numeric score, but then I'll ask them to go talk to somebody that knows you very well, a roommate, a best friend, a mother, father, and ask them to read it and ask them, does this sound like you? I would say about half the time the student, when they ask somebody else to read it, they say, yes, that's you down to a T. Perfect description of you. But about half the time, no, it doesn't. And then I have the student do a little more research. Now, pretty routinely, especially if I have a psychology major that is doing this, they will make sure to inform me that the Myers-Briggs test is not one that has high scientific validity, and often will not repeat to the same score. That's true. The best test out there, if we were doing a psychological profile, is the Big 5 personality test, sometimes called the Ocean test. I know that, I'm well aware of it, but we use the Myers-Briggs, and one of the reasons is because there is a depth of knowledge on many, many different sites, because the Myers-Briggs has been around for, I would imagine, almost 100 years now. It's quite old. But we use that one because it actually helps give us an archetype. And an archetype is, an example of an archetype would be a hero. When I say hero, almost everybody has a picture of a hero that pops into their mind, and a hero has common denominators or common characteristics that most heroes share. If I were to say defender, what would pop into your mind? That's a type of an archetype. It's a person that defends. So the Myers-Briggs helps us get closer to archetypes, which makes all of this stuff a lot easier, especially later on with other assignments that I'm not going to talk to you about, so we'll just keep moving forward. So once they have the student or client take the test, they write down their score, their numeric score, and then I have them go out and search multiple websites. And the first one is I ask them to search to find out, well, what is this description of you? What does it say your personality is like? Try to get a bunch of that information. Once they get usually 2 or 3 pages of that, then the next thing I have them do is to search their 4-letter score, so ISTJ or ENTJ or whatever your score is, and careers and a careers to avoid. Now, we do this for a few reasons. One, we want to figure out what's the common denominator in the careers we should avoid. Every semester, I get 1 or 2 students that's pursuing a career or an education to a career for something that they've come to find out they're really not wired to do. If that's you and you're in that situation, well, if I was dealing with a student with that, we would brainstorm ideas to both go ahead and use their education, but to get into a position that they're kind of wired to do and that would fit more of a recommended career for them. One example, I had a young lady that was going to school for nursing. She was in her last year, and she came to find out that in her Myers-Briggs profile, it said one of the jobs she should stay away from is nursing. She was a very unempathetic person, but she's more than 90% of the way through her schooling. She's not going to now stop and try to get a degree in something else. It's cost prohibitive, and it's just not worthwhile to do that in her situation. So what we did is we brainstormed ideas on how you use a nursing degree to do something more along the lines of the careers it recommended. So what she did is she went into nursing for a couple years and then became a nurse trainer, where she actually would get up in front of a room of 20 new nurses and train them at how that particular hospital does business. And that's where this individual found a lot more success and enjoyment in life. But she did have to get through 2 years of working as a regular frontline nurse before she could get there. Now, number C is Google your 4-letter score and then go to multiple sites and Google the strengths and weaknesses for that type. I try to have the students get 15 strengths and weaknesses, have them cut and paste in a Word document. Once they find those, then I tell them to circle the top 3 strengths that they think they have and to circle the probably the strongest weakness, if I suppose you can't say that, the weakness that most stands out, that others would look at this person and say, yeah, that is kind of a weakness of yours, and to circle 2 or 3 of those so you're aware of them, because as you might imagine, we're going to use those to answer questions later on. So when I have students go through this and they compile all this information, we're using it in the class. We get into quite a bit of detail to answer 3 of the most commonly asked interview questions. And those 3 questions include, first, you're almost always asked, tell me a little bit about yourself. Talk to me about your background, some of those things. Just give me an idea of who you are. So tell me about yourself, or a little bit about yourself is it's probably the most commonly asked interview question. So once we have that question, I have the student break this one question down into 4 parts, and we're going to try to come up with an answer. Now, the goal to all of this is that we're writing a script to answer these interview questions. Now, even though we're writing a script, I'm not suggesting that you read off this in an interview, but I do recommend you start off as a script and not just bullet points. So the first thing we do when trying to answer, tell me a little bit about yourself, and you have to have the job description for this, is you want to give the interviewer a brief introduction. Okay, that would be the probably number 1 qualification for that particular job. So an example script I have here is, I'm Bruce Johnson. I'll be completing or just completed a degree in microbiology. While completing my degree, I've developed 1 or 2 skills that, again, or I've worked for 3 years as a whatever when I worked for so-and-so or such and such or in that department. Okay, so you're trying to get that right away. What's the main seller or the main qualification that they are asking for right away? So that's a commonly used script. So give a brief introduction to the interviewer, and I have them write that in this tan area or yellow area in the cell there. The next way we bring it up is I tell them to come up with 3 of the skills or experiences that the job description is asking for that are the most applicable ones for you. In other words, you have a competency in those skills. So the first thing they do is look at the job description And in this first column here, 1, 2, and 3, they put down skills required on the job description that they have experience in. So they write here down the skill. Over here then, they put the example or the competency that they have in that skill and where they got that from. So maybe one of them, a skill required would be knowledge of generally accepted accounting principles or a double entry bookkeeping process. So then in your competency, if it's a student, they'd usually say, well, I've taken 6 accounting classes where we've gotten into, deeper levels of double entry bookkeeping and reconciling and monthly reports and annual reports and stuff like that. So, and you don't have to write a lot here. Just give the skill and then give the competency that you've had in that skill or where you've learned that. Then you do the second one and you do the third one. Again, you're picking the ones that are the most applicable to you, where you have experience or competency in that. And usually you want to pick the ones that are, on the standpoint of the job description, it's the big ones that the company's going to want. So rank order that. Now, again, we're just in the first question. Tell me a little bit about yourself. So the next part, we're going to break this down and answer is address any obvious concerns that the interviewer is going to have. Now, when I'm teaching young people, college students, experience is almost always the number one concern an employer would have. So give me 1 second here. I want to go back to this. How this works is when you're dealing with a negative or like this, an issue where maybe you don't have a competency that is really needed for this job. You, as the interviewee, want to address that. You want to address that before the interviewer addresses that. And I like to think of it this way: is when you address it, you're in control of it. If they address it, now they're in control of it. So you want to be in control of it. You want kind of that narrative around that obvious concern to be where you can explain it and say, look, I don't have 3 to 5 years of experience as an accountant, but I have taken 7 or 8 accounting classes. I was an accounting tutor. I did an internship with an accounting department for 6 months, and I believe, based on the skills you're asking, that even though I don't have the experience that you're asking for, I think I could still be able to do the job adequately, or even well. But again, you need to address it. If they address it, they're in control. If you address it, then you're in control. So you're going to address the obvious concern. What is it? Write about it. Then tell me how maybe that's not as much of an issue, and then write a script about it. Here's an example. I've not previously worked as an accountant, but I've worked for 2 different organizations while I was in college. I do have the required educational experience required for this entry-level position. I have knowledge of generally accepted accounting principles I learned while taking 4 accounting classes, and we were required to use Microsoft applications, especially Microsoft Excel, so on and so forth. So you're trying to overcome the obvious concern. So that's number 3. Number 4, another very important one. So the worst thing that you can almost do in a job interview, in my mind, is if they ask, why should we hire you? Don't ever say because you're a hard worker, okay? I hope most of you know what a Captain Obvious statement is. Okay, if you've ever seen the Expedia, I think it is, commercials, and they have a character, Captain Obvious, is he tells people the obvious. So, somebody's skydiving out of an airplane, Captain Obvious would say, you're falling to the ground. Like, hello, Captain Obvious, I know that. So don't ever, I recommend folks, don't ever say that you're a hard worker. There's a way better way to explain that. And you want to tell them that you're a hard worker, but you don't want to use the words, I'm a hard worker. Instead, when we go back, What you want to do is you're trying to prove your work ethic. So you want to use an example, something that you've done that if an average person did that, they might not, well, they wouldn't be average. So examples I have here, one is I worked at a Jimmy John's sandwich place and a Toyota dealership, and in both positions I received strong job performance reviews, got 4 out of 5s on both. At Jimmy John's, they actually asked me if I would consider a shift management position. So you're going to, instead of saying you're a hard worker and trying to explain why, you're not even going to say you're a hard worker. You're just going to say, here are things that are evidence that I'm a hard worker. And these should be things that the interviewer doesn't have to be, but it would be nice if the interviewer can go do some background looking and find out that, yeah, you did in fact get asked to consider a shift management position. One of the best ones I ever saw in that case about kind of being a hard worker, a young lady came in and she was interviewing for a teller position, and she mentioned that she had worked for McDonald's for 4 years and she never called in sick, and never missed a day of work all 4 years while she was in high school and college. And I remember multiple managers and the HR manager, we were talking afterwards, and we all agreed, okay, that's impressive. You worked in food service, never called in sick, you were there whenever possible. And she also was asked to consider an assistant manager position. That, she knocked it out of the park, and she was actually subsequently probably one of the better employees I've ever worked with. So, rock star candidate. So again, you're proving your work ethic with an anecdotal evidence that hopefully the interviewer could go do some digging and find that out. So then the end part of all this, what I have students do is combine all of them, okay? So we just took all the samples or examples here on the right side, or down the center actually, that you wrote out, and then put it into a paragraph format. Now, why do that? Well, in essence, because when you're going to communicate this, most of us don't speak in outline format. Most of us speak in terms of narrative or in a paragraph format. So I ask students to put all that together. It doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be perfect. At some point, I do ask that they have a couple of people that they trust or admire, respect, maybe mentors, that they read this to see, are you saying anything that needs to be wordsmithed? So we have them put it all together, and that's the answer to tell me a little bit about yourself. So once they put that together, the other thing I ask that they do is get a word count. So most of the time, you do not want more than 200 to 300 words. You don't want to speak much longer than a minute or 2 minutes when you're telling a little bit about yourself. If you speak for 5 or 10 minutes, then you're talking too much, and then they get concerned that, are we hiring a know-it-all or somebody that can sure talk a lot, but that's all they do. So the next ones we cover in detail in my sales class is asking, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And these are oddball techniques that I've had many students do, and they constantly will contact me after they apply these techniques and say, oh my gosh, Bruce, you were right, that worked like a charm. The first one is your strengths. So you already should have a bullet pointed list of all the strengths and weaknesses according to the Myers-Briggs. Try to find them from multiple websites. Ask yourself which ones are the ones that are probably your best strengths and which ones are your worst weaknesses. So we ask here, what are your strengths? Try to give the most applicable ones. And you may also want to put in here why that would be beneficial to this position. There's a rule in selling that you don't ever want to sell features, you always want to sell benefits. Why should I get this? What's the benefit to this? So over here, we're given a sample. So I tell students, this is the weird sort of hack, is tell them that you took a personality assessment. So I actually took a class at SDSU, took a personality class that better helped me figure out what some of my strengths and weaknesses are, especially based on how others perceive me. because that's really what they're interested in. Okay, they employers, and I know this is kind of hard. Employers don't want an answer about you or to yourself. Okay, they don't care about what you think. What they're concerned about is how do others perceive you. So I think I forgot to hit the transition button. I'm going to go to back to the Word document, just in case I did miss this. Okay, this Word document has it has the exercise written out to help you with it. So back down to our strengths and our weaknesses. So again, I tell them I took a class that showed me my personality. It helped me to figure out what some of my strengths and weaknesses are. But I always tell them, say this one line, especially concerning how others perceive me, or especially how others perceive me. When you say that, okay, you're telling them that, hey, I'm emotionally intelligent. I know you don't care what I think my strengths are. What you want to know is, out of 100 people, what are my strengths? So then you, as the manager that's hiring, can put me in a good position where I will be successful. And that's not based on something I think. I'll give you an example. I think I'm a pretty empathetic person. If you were to go ask my wife if I'm empathetic, she would say I am the least empathetic person she's probably ever met in her life. How we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us can be very different. I have one piece of research that says something like 70% of people see themselves differently than how others see them. So again, you perceiving yourself can be very inaccurate. What the hiring manager wants to know is how others perceive you. Okay. Now, the other thing, when we're looking at the document here, is then give your strength. So here I say that script. Well, let me share this one. One of the things that often happens when the candidate or the student tells them that they took a personality assessment, especially if you have an HR person in the room with you, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to ask, which one was it? And you'll say, well, Myers-Briggs. Oh, I took the Myers-Briggs too. What'd you get? What's your score? Oh, ISTJ. I'm an INTJ. And then you'll talk about that, and they'll talk about how, oh, we did that 2 years ago, and all the employees loved it, and it helped out so much. And, oh, have you taken the DISC test? What'd you get as a DISC score? And they'll go through, 2, 3, 4 different types of these tests. And the interview all of a sudden turns into like a friendly discussion about, what have you done? I've done this. And it's almost like you're developing a relationship. Again, when students say that, it's shocking how often that's what ends up happening. In one case, a young lady was telling me, she's like, I didn't even interview after I brought that up. She's like, we just talked about that the entire time. And of course I asked, well, did you get the job? And she said, easily had the job. Cakewalk after you were developing the relationship with the hiring manager by saying you took a personality assessment. So one of the other reasons I use the Myers-Briggs as opposed to the Big Five typology indicator, it's been around for 100 years. It is the most commonly used psychometric personality test in the corporate world. Again, is it very effective? If you were a psychologist, you maybe wouldn't want to use that. If you were doing quantitative testing, you may not want to use it. But I am willing to use it and have my students use it. One, to share with others that have taken it what they got, but also to kind of indicate to them, the hiring person, that, hey, I'm emotionally intelligent. I know what all this stuff is about, and I've learned this stuff. And again, that's just overwhelmingly a benefit when they do that. Okay, so then I have them give 2 of their strengths and try to give a little bit of an anecdote about maybe, or at least have in your pocket an anecdote of when you used that strength or when it worked and when it was helpful. Next, we go to the weaknesses. So when you're asked, what are your weaknesses? I tell students, have a couple of them, maybe even 3 of them, but only tell them the number one weakness that you have. Numero uno. So here I give an example of, well, one of the weaknesses I learned about was my tendency to be perceived as domineering to others. A good friend of mine said I get that way, and kind of figured out that it's when I'm really passionate about something, that's when I start kind of becoming dominant. This happened when I was talking to my significant other one time, and was talking about, hunting, and just was really getting into it. And they told me they felt like they couldn't get a word in edgewise, and I made this all about me. Once you tell the story, then you got to tell of an anecdote of how you learn to overcome that. If you give a weakness and you don't give how you've learned to overcome that, then you just gave them one reason not to hire you, and also communicated that I have weaknesses, but I don't care. I can live with them. You'll live with them too. So tell me then how you overcame that. So here I envision how other people will perceive me. When I try to present my point of view, I try to remember how they perceive things. So I orientate it towards, what they'll best understand given their personality. So we give that, again, the more of an anecdote or an actual situation where that happened and you learned a lesson from it, the better you'll do when answering that question. That gets us into one other issue that you might find in interviews. It's pretty common anymore to have what's called a behavioral interview. And behavioral interviews have usually a series of questions, maybe 10 of them. And what they'll ask is, it'll be along the lines of, tell me about a time when you ran into a conflict. What happened? How did you deal with it? Now, to answer those questions and score highly usually on those assessments in the interview is, you need to remember to hit 3 things. You got to tell them what happened. You got to tell them, what was the conflict about, and you got to tell them how you dealt with it and what was the end result. You have to hit all 3 of those. Think of it as a story where you became the hero because you conquered whatever the weakness was. So behavioral interviews, I always think of it as there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you get asked that question, you need to make sure you tell the situation, what was the conflict or the problem, what did you implement as a solution, and what did you learn from it, or what was the end result. So you have to hit all 3. Now, when interviewers score those, they'll take all the applicants and they'll have a point scoring system, and whoever has the most points rises to the top of the pile for another round of interviews. So again, that's called a behavioral interview, and you'll want to be prepared for that. Okay, so when we go back to our exercise or worksheet, I have students in a detailed manner go ahead and write all of this out. Okay, so they'll write out their script, and then I'll have them compile it in paragraph form and tell me, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses. So what ends up happening after they do, so I do this in just one class, I do another similar assignment, which is the rest of the questions in a different class. I figured that would incentivize students to take multiple classes with me. So we have them write it out paragraph form. The next thing I have them do is, I recommend they go through all the 12 or 15 most commonly asked interview questions, and I'll share those with you now. The next thing, after in paragraph form they wrote out their script, I have them sit down, or recommend they sit down, talk to 2 or 3 people, and do a mock interview. And I tell them, when you're doing the mock interview, don't read directly off your paper, directly off of it. Read it, time it. See how long it lasted. If you're talking for more than 2 minutes at a crack, you have too much information there. The other piece of that is, we want to make sure that you're not attaching yourself to any phrases or words that need to be wordsmithed and that are very bad. One of the words, for example, students will find when they take the Myers-Briggs is, it'll say one of their weaknesses is being arrogant. You don't ever want to tell an interviewer that you're arrogant. That's a no-no word, okay? And there's a number of other ones. So you need to find a synonym for arrogance. Maybe lighten it up a little bit, but again, you don't want to use arrogant. So the reason you read off the paper is to make sure there aren't any words like that or phrases or other things. Once you have that in a good format, somebody else has read it, you've timed it, you figured that out, then the next step is rewrite it in outline format. So one of the first times I did this assignment, I had a student ask me, Bruce, I get it, we're writing scripts, but would you actually bring this into an interview and read off the paper? And I said, no, that would look very weird. But then I thought about it for a minute. And I thought, if I saw a candidate that came in and had written up answers to 15 or 20 of the questions, most commonly asked interview questions, I don't think I'd even interview the person. I think I would just hire them, because that'd be the textbook definition of being prepared. Okay, so even if you left it like that, I think it wouldn't be the end of the world. It would just show you're highly prepared. But I would definitely not read off it. Second of all, I would do it in outline format, so you're putting down stuff to remember, to jog your memory about what not to forget. Okay, so everything you want to make sure you remember. Now, what if the interviewer asks about it? Then you just politely say, look, I wrote down some notes because I didn't want to miss anything, and I wanted to be as thorough as possible in the job interview, and I thought writing up an outline would help. I think if you did that, it would not look weird. I think it would be highly effective, and it would help you to not forget very important things. So I think that's totally fine. So once the students do that, once they've answered the remaining 13, 12, whatever questions that are most commonly asked, and I'll go through those in a minute, then using their outline format, practice doing a mock interview where you're trying to remember everything so you're not reading off paper. Practice doing a mock interview 3 or 4 times. Now, I was kind of proud of my nephew when he was getting ready to interview. I had mentioned to him when he was younger, before you do that, call me, because I got an idea here for you to try, and he did. And the real part that I was proud of him is, one, he actually took the time to write down the answers. The next thing he did once he did write down the answers is he found a friend, a competitive friend. Both of them were mechanical engineers, and both of them wanted to get good jobs where they made a lot of money. And both of them knew those types of jobs usually have many, many candidates going after them. So it's when you're trying to compete, in his case, with 20 or 30 other engineering students, and engineering school's not a cakewalk by any sense of the imagination. So if you're competing against that, you need to be locked on. You need to make sure you're knocking it out of the park. So he found a friend that was as competitive as him, and they sat down and they practiced it, and they practiced it until they had a very high level of comfort. I think he said it was 3 or 4 times is all they walked through with it and did it, and then both felt like they were pretty confident when they'd walk in. Now, you don't want to sound like you're reading off a script or something and be that confident, although that's better than being not confident. You want to portray yourself as a human being, okay? But you want to make sure that you're confident enough where if maybe you say something stupid, you don't freeze up and think to yourself, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. But instead, you're able to say, okay, I said something stupid, but I can move on, and I can gain control of myself here to move on with the interview. That's a pretty solid level of confidence. So let's go ahead, look at the remaining questions that I have listed for you there on that Word document. Okay. Now, the one thing I want to remind everybody, when you're answering these questions, be careful to try to answer them exactly how something online says you should answer them. Instead, answer them honestly. The worst thing you can have is you kind of, I don't even know if you'd say it's a white lie, probably less than that. but you answered something that maybe wasn't 100% truthful, and now you have a situation just like I explained where the company doesn't want you there, you don't want to be there, and now you have to explain to your next employer why you have 6 months or don't have a job listed for 6 months because you were embarrassed about it. So when you answer these questions, continue to use the Myers-Briggs, continue to use your experience in the job description to answer these things. Think it through when you're doing it. So some of the most commonly asked interview questions that I looked up and had my students kind of filter through to see what they were. I think we got up to 19 or 20, 18, I guess. Go back up. So the first one is, what experience do you have that relates directly or indirectly to this position? Now, I coach a lot of young people, college students, and a lot of times they don't have direct experience doing some particular job. The question comes in, well, do you really need exact direct experience? If you're performing surgery, then the answer is probably yes. Whereas if you're trying to obtain a sales position, then what they're trying to figure out is, are you the type of person that won't give up and will you keep working towards a goal? So, and maybe you say, well, yeah, I worked at McDonald's for 4 years, like the young lady I told you. I think that could be used as indirect experience for a sales position. Again, you're just trying to prove you're not going to give up. So try to find any of the experience. Make sure you jot these down on paper too when you're reading through the job description. Next, number 2, why do you want to work for this company as blank? Now, here's where you need to go back to the first question. What are the skills that you have that match in the job description? That's what you want to list. Interviewing is not about you. It's about helping a company solve a problem. Okay? That's what the idea is. And when you can look at the world and that means, usually you can come up with better answers. Question number 3, what motivates you? I tell people use the Myers-Briggs to answer this. If you go on to Truity and a number of other websites that talk about the Myers-Briggs, you'll find on there that they'll have motivators for each typology. Maybe public accolade is what motivates you. Whereas a lot of people, if you try to, give an award to somebody in front of 100 other people, they would rather die than walk up there to get an award. So that clearly doesn't motivate you. In fact, that would do the opposite of motivating you, which you don't want to do that to a person. And again, how you're motivated using a psychometric test, that's answering the question they're really asking, okay? Number 4, what's your ideal work environment? One of the things you have to ask is if that's different than for the job you're applying for. So if you say, I love to work outdoors and you're applying to work at a bank, you've got a little bit of a problem. So make sure you take that into consideration, okay? Is the work environment you're setting out to do, is this work at this employer that? Number 5, do you like working independently or do you like working with a team? Now, for many of us, the answer is both, okay? And that's a fine answer. You might want to get into a little more detailed, well, when do you find you like to work independently? Now, again, it's vitally important when you're asked this to have somebody else read the answers to this, because there's a lot of responses that I would say they're not going to be at all helpful for you. So you might want to say that, well, I like to work independently when in working with a team we can't solve any problems. That's not a good answer, because in every team on planet Earth, there's always a problem, and there's modes that all teams go through. So that's why it's important to have somebody else read that, especially somebody that's got 10 or 15, 20 years of experience, especially if they have hiring experience. Number 6, describe your best boss. Now, one of the things I have students do in my class is I tell them for this question, use the website Truity. And on Truity, you can go into, I believe it's relationships, or the relationship tab in there. And it has the 4 different kind of typologies split up into 4 groups. And it gives you Ones that can be opposite types that can be very effective and helpful in a relationship. It can find the ones where they're usually talking about your loved one or your significant other, but you can use it to answer this question. The ones, if you were to describe your worst boss, under Truity would be under the challenging opposites right here. Those are the ones that you probably don't want as your boss, okay? The other ones, you might want to pick the one that has the most complementary typologies. Now, when you're answering this, don't use the 4 letters ISFP or ENTJ or whatever. Instead, read the description, and that's what you want to write as an answer. So, for example, if I were to describe my best boss, I suppose it would be somebody that's doesn't think like me, but can deduce and come to the similar conclusions looking at similar evidence as I do. Now, I didn't say, oh, it's an INTJ or an ESFJ. I didn't say that. I said what was actually defined on the Truity website and why it is I would get along with those. For your worst boss, these are the 4 types that you're not very compatible with, and you might want to just, again, use the verbiage in there to explain what you wouldn't like about your worst boss. So here, I don't remember what the typology, ENTJ. So for a worst boss, I'm an ENTJ. I might say that the one typology that I don't work very well with would be the protector, okay, which is an ISFJ. So I would click on that, or I would read through this and I would write that down for a worst boss. Is I don't like somebody that's constantly trying to protect their work, protect their employees or others around them, because I'm not out there to hurt them. So you, again, don't use the letters, but give a description of why that would be the worst one. One of the reasons this is an effective way of answering that is because young people very often they haven't had enough bosses to tell you what a worst boss or a best boss is. I'll go back here one more time. You want to be so careful when you're answering those questions to communicate to them the logical answer, which is logic would be on the Myers-Briggs or the Truity website where I'm telling you to search this. What you want to watch out for is you don't want to say something stupid like, well, I don't want a boss that lies, or I don't want a boss that's lazy, or I don't want a boss that doesn't show up to work on time. That is not what they're asking. Nobody wants to work with a boss that lies. That's just assumed. And young people will have a tendency to answer in that manner. As a young person, you want to look as old as you can in that job interview, because you want to look like you have experience and you want to portray responsibility, okay? And you want to look professional. So you got to be careful answering that one question. Your worst boss is not, well, I don't want a lazy boss. Bad answer, okay? Imagine somebody that's 50 years old and they've had 7 bosses and say, well, what kind of boss do you not like? And that would probably be found using the relationships in the psychology, the psychometrics of that. All right, let's keep going here. Number 7, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Oh, I wish I had a good answer for this one. Mainly what's being asked in this question is not where do you really see yourself in 5 years. It's asking, are you going to be around for a while, or are you just going to take this job, and if you can't get promoted to the next thing, are you going to leave? For young people, depending on the career they're looking for in their education, you need to be cognizant of this, okay? And you need to be cognizant of what's the turnover like at the company you're applying for. You don't want to communicate that, oh, well, I'll be here for the next 5 years doing exactly this job, hopefully getting better every year and doing that, when that's not the truth. If you're a ladder climber, you might want to say that in there, and you want to have it wordsmithed correctly. say, well, I would be fine if I was in this position, but I like to think that I could be a person that could be promoted into maybe a management position. So I would like to work towards that, but whether or not I reach that in 5 years would to be determined. But I'd like to attempt to do that. Question 8, what was the most challenging thing that you've ever gone through? Usually what they're talking about is stress. Again, this is a behavioral interview question. Ask with the situation, what happened, how did you handle it, and then what was the outcome? Question 9, what's the most important thing you're looking for in your next role? Again, be honest in that. Be honest, but wordsmith. You want to tell the truth. You don't want to be deceptive. Simultaneously, though, you don't want to say the most important thing I'm looking for is higher wages or more money. Okay, that probably shouldn't use that one, anyways. Question 10, why are you leaving your current job? Now, for a lot of the college students I deal with, it's if they're working as a bartender part-time or a dishwasher, and they're going to college, there's a pretty strong chance that they're wanting to enhance their career opportunities in the future. So if you're a student and your last job was being a dishwasher at Culver's, you don't have to answer it, well, I didn't want to be a dishwasher for the next 40 years. Just say, it was a fun job that I had while I was in college, but now it's time for me to be a grown-up and move on. Question 11, tell me about a time you encountered a conflict with a coworker and how did you handle it? Now, I don't have this in here, but I'm going to put up another video at some point. And the video I'm going to talk about is something using what's called the Thomas Kuhlman instrument, which is a conflict resolution diagram or mode. And it's got 5 different ways that a conflict can be handled. First would be you could avoid it. You could try to fight to get what you want. You could accommodate, let the other person get what they want. You could compromise. You get a little but lose a little, they get a little but lose a little. Or you can do what should be your default, which is collaborate. Collaboration is usually a 6 to 8 step model that you go through that includes, it's a problem solving model, and it's define the problem. Make sure you define it correctly. Research everything until you understand it completely. 3 might be, okay, brainstorm some alternative solutions to handle the problem. When you do that, and I'll talk about this in the video, you don't evaluate the options or solutions when you're trying to write them up. The reason you don't do that is because, especially if you're working in a team, you don't want the other people to feel like you're judging what their ideas are, and then they don't want to give any ideas. So you don't ever evaluate the option until you get to the next step. So the middle between evaluating the options and creating them, okay, right in the middle is, I kiddingly say to people, go smoke a cigarette. I don't mean literally go smoke a cigarette. Nobody should smoke cigarettes. But what I'm trying to communicate is take a break. Okay, take a 5, 10 minute, 20 minute break if you're collaborating on something. Then come back, then you evaluate the alternatives that you've come up with. Then choose one, then implement it, then follow up and select other ways of handling it. Now, back to the conflict resolution models. When you're trying to explain about a time you had a conflict and how you're wanting to respond to that, if you can harness the Thomas Kuhlman modes of handling conflict, and you're dealing with somebody that's emotionally intelligent, you will communicate a world of information that you too are emotionally intelligent. You know what those 5 modes are, and you know that as long as you keep open-minded about most things, you have 5 ways you can handle a problem or handle a conflict, depending on who you're dealing with. And you know that there's a optimal kind of way to handle conflict, which is collaboration. What you're communicating is that you've received the training on how you actually should handle conflict. Okay. And again, if you don't cite the Thomas Kuhlman instrument or some other sort of copy of that type of format, the one that does say it in the interview and talks about the 5 different modes, they're the one that's going to go up to the next level, because that communicates you're emotionally mature and you're emotionally intelligent. All right, let's go back here. Next question. Question 12. Tell me about a time that you encountered serious levels of stress in a previous job and coworker, task, or customer. Again, behavioral interview question. Tell what happened. Tell how you handled it. Tell about what was the end result. Now, one of the things you might want to mention if you're talking about stress is talk about exercising to mitigate stress. Or maybe you meditate, or you're somewhat religious and you pray. Okay, unless that's going to prevent you from getting the job. But you want to communicate to them that you know what stress is and you know how to mitigate it. And those are the main ways of mitigating it. Question 13, they might ask you, what are your salary expectations? It is so vitally important when you are asked this question that you have a ballpark number. Now, that being said, I'm fully well aware that still in 2023, many employers they don't want to communicate about salaries and money. Now, I want to say a couple things about that. If it was me and I was trying to apply for a position and there was no salary range or anything that was communicated with that, I would not accept the job, not until I would know that. Okay. Even if they were reluctant to tell me or communicate that information, I don't think I would accept the job. In 2023, if you cannot, as an employer, can't communicate a salary range to your prospective job applicants, you know what? Shame on you. That is ridiculous in 2023. If you are an employer, the people that are applying, they need to be aware of how much we're talking about here. One of the things you want to watch out for, and this happened to me, I often get headhunted for sometimes odd jobs and in other positions, and I was talking with somebody one day, and afterwards they said, well, what do you think? And I kind of was reluctant, and I said, well, to be honest with you, I'm not sure if I completely understand what I'm doing here, but I don't know how to compare it to my current work as an instructor and a business consultant. What if they were to say, well, the job pays $500,000 a year, I'd say, see ya teaching, see ya business consulting, let's have at it. What do you want to do? If that person, though, communicated, well, it pays $35,000 a year, you communicate a lot in that dollar amount. So again, I would be very reluctant if you don't have that information to consider saying yes. Now, it might be a situation where you operate under the assumption, let's say a mechanical engineer. Most starting wages for mechanical engineers in 2023 are probably between $55,000 to $70,000 right now. If you were applying for a mechanical engineering position, we can probably assume they're not going to pay you $12 an hour. Okay, I think that's a fair assumption. Now, does that necessarily mean you should ask what the compensation is? I think before you say yes, you should. But if you're just in the interview process, you don't have to bring it up. Okay, so again, I guess those are just my thoughts on salary expectations. More than anything, I want to communicate that if you're an employer and you're not sharing that information, you are woefully behind, and the candidates that you're going to recruit are going to be nowhere near as good and nowhere near as what you want than if you publish that information. Even if you're at the low end of a parameter or spectrum there in wages, if you don't communicate it, you're creating more problems for yourself in the end. So employers, don't do that. Make sure you communicate that information. Let's go back to this. Question 14, do you have any questions for me? Make sure that you do have a few questions and make sure they're logical questions, okay? Stay away from anything offensive. This is the one time you can Google good questions to ask an employer in a job interview, okay? Maybe it's asking, well, what do you think is the number one value of the organization based on your job and what you do as the employer or as the hiring manager? Question 15, what is one of your biggest failures? Again, it's vitally important you write these down and you think about them. One of the exercises I have my students do in class is before we do this exercise, we do a speed dating exercise, and it's speed dating for job interviews. So the students break up into groups or into teams of two, and I don't tell them what's going on. They break up into the team, and I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. One of you is the interviewer, one of you is the interviewee, and I tell them who. Then I say, okay, we're going to do a quick job interview, and I want you to tell them a little bit about you and vice versa, and then we time it. We have them do it. Most young people can only talk about themselves for 20 to 30 seconds. Those that can go longer than 30 seconds, which isn't usually enough, you want it to be about a minute, maybe 2 minutes. If they're talking longer about answering the question, tell me a little bit about yourself, they're often communicating information employers don't want to know. If you're applying as a mechanical engineer, nobody wants to know that you grew up with 3 dogs. You know, one was named Fido, one was named Butch, and one was named Barbie. You don't. That's irrelevant information, and that can be detrimental in a job interview. So again, when asking what is your biggest failure, you want it to be your biggest failure, and you need to think that out. You need to think it through. All right, back to it. Question 16. What do you like least about your current job? I strongly encourage for this one, you use the Myers-Briggs, and you think about it, and you kind of meditate and think over it. What do you not like? Then look in the Myers-Briggs and see if there's a common denominator there with careers to avoid. Okay, pay attention to that. Now, when you don't have a lot of experience, the Myers-Briggs can be very useful to find your weaknesses and your liabilities. And again, those are things you want to communicate, not in a negative manner, but you don't want to communicate the opposite of who you are, or what your preferences are. So again, think about that, meditate on it, look at the Myers-Briggs, see if there's common denominators, see if that really is something that maybe in your future you need to look out for. Question 17, why should I hire you? This one, I would try to use the Myers-Briggs, your life experience, your previous job experiences. Kind of goes back to the first question, tell me a little bit about yourself. Match those up in your qualifications that match the job description. You want to list them here. You also want to add in your Myers-Briggs strengths, okay? And you want to utilize your strongest strength, your number one strength out of all of them, so that they're aware that's really kind of who you are. And, you know, maybe you're a problem solver and that's just how you're wired and you're able to solve almost any problem. Last one, number 18. How would others describe you? Again, it is so vitally important you use the Myers-Briggs information. Okay. You might want to add in maybe some fun information like, oh, maybe you have a hobby as a model train something. Okay. Just to share with them that you are, in fact, a human being. But you want to communicate not what you think would be helpful for them. You want to communicate what something else, a third party, evidence suggests you would be good for this job. Because again, about 70% of the time, the way you see yourself is not the way others see you. So you're trying to match those things. And if you can, then you're going to be more successful. Okay, but again, this is not based on your opinion and what you think. That's not really what they're asking. What they're asking is if I have 100 other candidates that come in here for this one job, what are going to be the main strengths that you bring to the table that the others can't do? And does that match up with what we're asking for? All right. Okay, lastly, as I said before, once I recommend young people answer all these 18 questions. Now, there's something else with answering all 18 of these questions. Once you do that, I would argue quite strong that any question you get thrown in an interview, if you've written out answers to all 18 of these questions, you're going to be fine. Because if nothing else, that question would have to relate to one of the other 18 questions, or there's a 95% chance it will. So if that's the case, then you just got to reread or talk again about, what you had already said before. You're just kind of saying the same thing. So very important to do that. Now, I do want to reiterate my nephew, what he did, and I've seen others do this. I've seen a few managers or executive types that have also prepared for an interview by sitting down, often with their spouse or friend or significant other, somebody they trust, and do a mock interview. Mock interviews, folks, by doing that process, I would say on a level of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst anxiety you've ever experienced, if you practice this 4 to 5 times with an outline of answers to these questions, and this is just my opinion, but I think you would go from having an anxiety level in a job interview of like 6, 7, 8 maybe, and it'll drop it down to a 2 or a 3. It may be at 4 at most. That's how important that is. And when your anxiety is lower and you're really sharing who you really are, wordsmithed of course, then you're communicating to the employer the real you, the you that they're going to get every work day of the year, okay? And then they can make an informed decision on whether or not they want to hire you because you'd be a good fit for this job. So we go back to, is it a win for the company? If the answer is yes, great. Is it a win for you? Yes, great. Is it a win for those that you work with? Yes. Is it a win for the employee or the customers you'll be serving? Yes. Okay. Is this all in alignment? Looks to be. Okay. Is this a good fit for you and for all of those? And if the answer is yes, then you're communicating enough where everybody involved can say, let's move forward, let's do this. Just want to double check that we don't miss anything else. Again, I've had many students, especially those that are in competitive job interviews, where anything from having 40, 50, 60, one student had 100 other applications. And he got the job. He filtered through all of those and he beat out some highly qualified candidates. So A+ for him. That's phenomenal. But he said he did it by practicing. He did it by, when he walked into the room, and he was graduating school. He wasn't that old, and he was going up against people that were 25, 6, 7, 8, 9, probably 30. He's going up against these same candidates, and he's beating them out because the manner in which he presents himself is truthful, it's positive, it's professional, and that's what they want to see. I think for the most part that is it. Again, it works well for, especially if you're competing in highly competitive job environments. As I said at the beginning of the videos I want to put out are the ones that my students indicate to me. They communicate to me and say, that's a good project, that's a good tool. I've never heard of that tool. Nobody else has ever shared using that tool like you did, Bruce. And the reason I want to share that with the world and communicate that, and it's free of charge. One, it's because I'm in academics and we like to share information and help people predominantly, and I want to help others to get a leg up, especially if you're willing to watch this entire video in order to help yourself get to that level. So hope that works for you. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below in the comments section. Make sure you like and subscribe the video if you do in fact like and found this information helpful. I hope soon to have a few other videos out there. Have a wonderful rest of your day.